why human flourishing is important, how we might approach a collective learning journey together to understand flourishing. Themes that we've heard are this idea of humility, both intellectually and across disciplines and across cultures. How do we expand to other cultures and other groups that may not be represented here, part of our journey? And we've explored various frameworks. We're now shifting a bit into the more practical side of our day. We're going to spend some time with the business and investment community, tech community, and we'll also take some time with the philanthropic and nonprofit community as well to explore why does this matter, how do we implement this in our systems and our institutions. But first, before we do that, to tee up the business conversation, we're going to have one of our friends and colleagues, Jim Ritchie-Dunham, who is the president of the Institute for Strategic Clarity, has done some really interesting work on collaboration across organizations, collaboration within organizations on this topic of well-being and flourishing. He's also a colleague at Harvard, at the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, a research affiliate there, and has been integrally involved in the Global Flourishing Study. And he's also a professor at Boston College Business School, so very appropriate for our topic about business. So Jim, why don't you share with us your thoughts about the question of what's the relationship between human flourishing and the economy?
Thank you. It's a big question, and so what I'd like to share is some of what we're learning along this path of connecting human flourishing and economic pursuit. And as you said, I teach in the business school. I've been teaching in business schools from Mexico, Europe, and the United States for the last 29 years. And so I'm not a recovering business school professor. I still teach there. But trying to say, how can we bring these concepts into organizations and what is the impact of that? I'd like to share a little bit of what we're learning right now. So I'm going to cut to the end of the presentation and say, what is the main point? Why should advancing human flourishing be the purpose of an economy? And I'm going to suggest two findings. One is that if we make the human being a replaceable machine part, what some people were calling a robot, what we find is the net result of that, the value in the system, is net negative. And so that's going to be a strong statement, but no matter what you do to try to improve on extracting value from people, it always leads to a net negative result. You destroy more value than you generate. And the simple way that we're working in businesses, and when I say business, it's business, nonprofits, networks, organizations, is when you start from that perspective, you're starting with a no. So the question we ask in organizations is everything that you're doing aligned with what you see to be important? What do you really care about in the world? And what are you really trying to do? And are you aligned with that? Or are you starting with a no? This is simple language, but are you starting with a yes or with a no? You say, well, I don't agree with everything that I'm doing. I don't understand that this is the way I really want to be doing it, but we have to sort of accept that. So what we're discovering is if you start with a no, you're starting with a net negative value. You're starting with shutting down energy that's available to you in the room. And it's a simple question. For example, so you paid to have this room together. These people came together in your business. You had 10 people sitting in the room. They sat together for a couple hours. So what was the cost to you of doing that? And they're like, $1,250 times 2, $2,500. So how much of the creativity that all these people that you brought into the room, how much did they share? Like, they said, I don't know. And I said, well, I asked them. And they said, well, they shared, how many ideas or creative thoughts did you have during that time? I had 10, 15 in those 2 hours. How many did you share? 0 or 1 or 2 is a very typical number. And so you paid to have those folks in the room, and you didn't get any of the creativity out of them. That's just not very smart. So how much energy, the way we're starting to frame this to try to understand what's happening, and I'll share a little bit more about that, is what is the entropy of that, or what is the energy lost? And what we discover, and when you start with this no or this negative value, is that the energy loss is very high. The disengagement, the Gallup studies show that disengagement is very high. And the costs are very high of not taking advantage of that. And the inequities that you're generating are very high. Versus when you put a human being at the center, what we have come to call homo lumens, or beings of light, beings of creativity, the net result, no matter how incompetent you seem to be at knowing what you're doing, whether, and I use our colleagues that we're discussing in the first case, is even when we don't know what we're doing, when we put people at the center, what we're finding from the data is the results are always net positive. You generate more value than you extract. So that's kind of interesting of, even when you don't know what you're doing and not doing it very well, if you're starting from there, it seems to be that it's always positive. So starting with your yes leads to net positive value. The energy loss is far lower. Engagement's far higher. The costs are much lower, and the inequities that you're generating are much lower. So that comes to say that if you assume scarcity, from the language that we've been sharing earlier today, now I can say this, because in business environments it's still difficult, but you're subverting love. And what you're doing is letting disinterest win. That I really don't care what you think. I don't really care who you are. The disinterest wins, the love is subverted. Versus in that second finding is that if you assume abundance or that there's plenty, depending on how we're in relationship with it, what you're subverting is the disinterest, and love manifests. So this is what we're starting to find. But I want to finish with my final point would be that independent of the choice of focus, what I'm going to suggest in the next 20 minutes is that whether you're focused on output efficiency as a definition of your economy or a better world, well-being, taking advantage or recognizing the vast stock or accumulation of existing knowledge, experience, learning, and potential always leads to better results for you. So even if you're in that extractive mode, you can do better by paying attention to some of these other human factors. So now I want to play with that a little bit in what I'm sharing. So what is the purpose of an economy? That's obviously a very big question, right? And so I'm not going to pretend that I know the answer. I'm going to go back to a couple of economists that have some of the biggest textbooks that we use in economics. The study of how society manages its scarce resource. That's economics. That's Mankiw, Gregory Mankiw out of Harvard. It's in his textbook, first pages. Or Paul Samuelson, the most efficient use of resources. That's where economics makes its unique contribution. So we see two worldviews in this about what the purpose of economics is, or economy. One starts from scarcity and says that scarcity describes everything. And some of my colleagues who are recovering economists or are straight up economists, they look at me and say, if you believe anything else other than that, you're an idiot. And they just look at me like, I can't believe that you believe anything other than this. So, well, let's just play, because what I'm going to come to is when we meet groups who are very high engaging and very high performing, what I do is just ask them how they see the world. So what Katie's talking about, the collective inquiry. But I'm not going to come at you with assumptions about how you should do things. That's what I used to do as a business professor. You should do things the way we teach here in the school, because obviously we're smarter than you. That's why you're coming to learn from us. Versus we started asking them questions of, well, what do you actually do when you're high-performing, high-engaging organizations? And we never heard that language. So, but there's a belief that scarcity describes everything, and this abundance stuff, or this meeting people and people-centered, that's nice and it's fleeting. We'll invest in training, we'll invest in doing this flourishing stuff when we have the time and money. And then we never end up having it. Or it's nice for a little bit, then something happens, we're going to cut all that stuff. The most common forms, and we talked about some of these in the morning, that we see of organizational forms is an extractive, what I'm calling extractive, and it's zero-based. And zero-based here is some jargon that we're introducing to say you're starting from, if I give you anything other than zero, you're better off. The case study that I'll share with you is around microfinancing. We're working with a big microfinance bank in Latin America. But there is it, you have $0 in your account. I'm going to give you $100, so you're better off than zero. But the starting point is you are and have zero. And so what we want to start understanding from that implicit model that's working there is I'm assuming that you have zero, but zero in everything. So if I give you something, you're better off than zero. And we find that is very typical in what I'll call extractive ways of looking at the world. You got some value, I'm going to go get it. I'm going to give you a $100 loan. You got to go get an extra $10, bring back 110 in 4 weeks, right, or in a couple months. So you got to go get extracted from someplace else to give it to me. Some people are trying to improve on that, and we're thinking of that as 0+. So we're going to still do the extractive piece, but we're going to give you a little bit more. Right? So we'll give you additional services, but we're still going to charge you the same way of thinking about that. So we're still starting from you don't have anything, but we're going to offer you a little bit more in a very transactional way of looking at the world. Well, that's one worldview, but we're finding that there's a very large, I'll give a little evidence to that in a minute, a very large percentage of humanity, meaning much greater than 0, that doesn't start with that worldview. So we found hundreds of groups that we've worked with in 49 countries that don't start from that view. They start from an abundance describes everything. So meaning that there's infinite potential and creativity in human beings. It just depends on how you're in a relationship with nature and these other things. So there, they say scarcity is an important special case. And so if we go back to Alfred Marshall and some of these who defined scarcity for economics back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they said most things are infinitely abundant. Air's abundant, water's abundant, so we don't need to think about that stuff. But scarcity is a special case for how do we figure out what the price and quantity is at the moment of exchange, and thinking abundantly doesn't get us there. What they did was they said, we're going to be able to use calculus to integrate out possibility and take out change in time. So we're taking all that learning over time stuff out and learning over possibility out so that we can come to what's available in this instant. And that allowed us to see price and quantity. But they were very explicit that that's a special case. It's not definitive of everything. And we kind of forgot that, and a lot of what we've developed is that that's the only truth versus it's very true in a very specific interaction. So there, what we're finding is the most common forms are more flourishing or transformative. So they're saying you're not starting with 0. I'm asking the question of what are you starting with? You can think of asset-based community development. You can think of strengths-based approaches. What are you starting with? And is what we're contributing to what you're starting with adding something extra? And again, this isn't what I think we should be doing. This is what we're finding in the groups that we're going out and working with and studying. So the groups that start from this abundance describes everything. They're saying, well, you're starting with something, and is what we're adding creating more value than what you started with. So you're net 0, meaning, or you net positive or net negative because of our interaction. So it's starting from a different place. A way to think about, for me, why do we have this scarcity view is thinking about the economic challenge we were facing in the late 1800s, early 1900s, about efficiency of our output. Can we be far more efficient in our outputs? And how do we think about risk-adjusted investment? How do we get more for less investment? And so we developed some tools, some people have mentioned them earlier, that might have been helpful at that time to help us think about efficiency of our outputs. Let's not be extraordinarily wasteful in what we're doing. So GDP seemed to be helpful, and there was a lot of criticism of the folks who developed that. It's only for that. It's not for everything else that we're going to be applying it to. But it could be helpful in this moment. And then thinking of return on investment to your shareholders. He said that could be useful to think about what is the risk in an investment. So it could be useful. It shouldn't describe everything. But that was our first pass. So what I'm suggesting is that we're finding now is the second path. And it might be 3.0, 4.0, I'm not sure, but to say that was useful for a period, but maybe now we're asking a lot of different questions, such as a group that we're working with of newly minted chief sustainability officers. There are a lot of organizations are creating the CSO position within their C-suites. And in Mexico, the stock exchange invited us to create a certification program for new CSOs this year. We started in May, our first cohort, and we're just finishing our second cohort of 51 leaders doing that. And what they're looking for is how do we start to measure and think about the challenge we have now is sustainable regenerative capacity. The capacity to regenerate our own support, the resources we need on a sustainable basis. A big challenge that I'll talk a little bit in the panel for philanthropy, is also around systemic inequity, right? So it's all over the place. It's really obvious that we have to deal with these. And the things that helped us deal with the first pass of economic challenges aren't helping us deal with what we're facing today. So I think we're in that place of what could be useful, what available tools, and we're suggesting that flourishing and a framework we're developing that I'll share now, total value generated in the ecosystem. So you're participating in an ecosystem. What's the baseline when you started? And is the whole system better off because you participated? And how would you measure that and pay attention to that? So again, the second pass on what are some of the challenges that people are facing and how could we deal with them? One of the reasons I've come to flourishing in the last few years is trying to find ways that we can look at what is the whole human being. And so I like this description in flourishing is the complete human well-being. That's in the National Academy of Sciences paper that Tyler published. And then starting to look at what does that mean and what would we be measuring in an organization if we're doing this. So we start with, well, what is the health? And so we can look at, well, there's physical health, there's social health, mental, spiritual. And how are we translating that? Do you have access to the material resources that you need? What relationships are happening? What is your understanding of the system that you're working in and your capacity to align fitness of what you have with the system that you're in? And spiritual, what is your purpose? And there's a lot of work happening in organizational practice right now around the purpose-driven. You look at the big PricewaterhouseCoopers, McKinsey, Accenture, they're all in the last few months publishing a bunch of stuff on purpose. Right? So at least somebody's starting to pay attention. The other thing that we're looking at is what we're thinking of regenerative capacities. So as we were talking about just before lunch, one is the outcomes. So looking to the past, what are the resources that we have available right now within us or in our organization? So that's the past or what's already completed. But also development or the verbs of life. What are we developing now in our relationships and our capacities? And there I like the enthusiasm word that you were bringing earlier of, what is it that's developing in process? But we're also looking at potential. What are the possibilities that we can see? And I was sharing over lunch, when I talk with executives, I say, okay, so tell me how you run your organization. And what are the structures and processes? How do you think about that? And they describe this very scarcity-based, very structured capacities orientation. Good. So then have you ever hired somebody new or ever brought anybody into your organization? Like, yeah, sure, I do that all the time. I said, so the only way, according to your rules, to hire somebody to do this job is that you hire somebody that's already doing the job. Because those are the only people that you know can do the job. I'm like, well, that's stupid. He said, of course I bring people in that don't have the job. I said, well, then how do you know they can do the job? Well, I can see, they can learn. They're doing something similar elsewhere, and they could learn how to do that here. So they can do that immediately? I said, no, well, it takes a while. I said, well, you just brought in that time thing. You just brought in that learning thing, but you said we don't do learning here. But you're assuming that they are, you're just not supporting it. I said, okay, so everybody that you're hiring to do something is already doing it elsewhere. I said, no, there are a lot of people we bring in that it's just going to be a good fit. Like, a good fit? What does that mean? I said, well, I can see it in your eyes. There's something about you that I know is going to work here. I said, you said it, I didn't. So what are you looking at when you're seeing another person who doesn't know how to do what we're doing today, but I believe could? Right? It's a good fit. There's something in here. So what are you looking at, and are you acknowledging? So we start to play with potential and the learning and outcomes or capacities, proven capacities. And so what we're going to do with these is go see what we can measure. So why measure? To me, there are two, grossly oversimplified, two schools of why we measure. One is because we want to know what we know. So then we measure to have an answer. Following, like with Katie's piece earlier, I think of it more as collective inquiry. So we're gathering data to ask better questions versus we now know exactly what's happening in a situation. So what we're measuring, as an example, is if we're trying to move towards sustainable flourishing, then we're, in the case that I'll share in a minute, I'm looking at total value generated. And here what we mean by total value generated is, what is the regenerative health? So it's a jargon term that we've come up with that's working within these organizations. To say, what is your health now? And what are the capacities you have to regenerate them? Looking at those potential development outcomes. So this has ended up being what's called they're calling a total value generated scorecard, as being used in these organizations that we're working with and a couple of cities now, is to look at across those 4 dimensions. So what's in the table is the 4 dimensions that were described in flourishing: the physical, social, mental, and spiritual. What can we ask to assess, well, where are you in the health? And how well are you doing on those? And then the regenerative capacities, and do you have those? What capacities do you have explicit in your structure and your processes around understanding what the capacities are right now, as well as learning and changing over time? Do you have that built into how you do things? And how do you see potential and work with that explicitly? And we're doing that, assessing those things through subjective health or survey data and administrative data. So we're able to go into these organizations and say, well, then what are the outputs and what are all the other things that you're measuring within your ecosystem? So what I want to share is what have we found so far, knowing that that's like a massively simplified version of it. What are we finding? And I'll give a case study here. I'm sorry, the print's a little small. The level of analysis, so here I'm talking about economics at the meso-micro level, so it's organizations or ecosystems or value chains of organizations and the individuals within them. And to do this, this map is very small, shows where we've taken the survey. So we have our survey looking at the level of experience that people are having within flourishing and outcomes and how they work together, what we call the health of their agreements. Across 126 countries, we now have about 135,000 responses looking at how they see their world. And what we're finding that's exciting is these, what we think of as net positives or positive deviants, are everywhere. And so it's starting to say it's not just that they're in Boston at my university, or just near San Francisco, or just near London or Tokyo, but everywhere we've looked, we're finding people that are doing high engagement, high performance, with very healthy or this abundance-based approach. And so they're everywhere. So that shifts the question of, if they're everywhere, why are we looking only to some of the economic capitals or financial capitals of the world, when how to do this in Ghana is right next door? So as an example, with Ghana, we were working with the Secretary of Economic Development, the Minister of Economic Development, and with the German Foundation. And he said, well, what are you talking about? I said, and my colleague asked him, he said, do you know of any groups that are very high performing, very high engaging groups in Ghana? He said, well, I used to be a senator from the Dagara region. I do. He said, what if we found more? There have to be more than the ones I already know. He said, and what if we started connecting them? He said, then maybe we'd look for how do we move to the next level within our own people versus going to places where the culture is completely different and doesn't fit with how we're doing. So if you receive my money, in this case a German foundation, then you got to do it our way, economic development our way. He said, but that's never worked. We have to customize it locally. He said, but we don't look locally for where that is. So anyway, so that's through the survey, we're starting to identify maybe the wisdom for how to do this locally is there. You just don't know how to look for it because you're asking a scarcity-based question versus this collective inquiry into what are you also learning. So, and then across all of that data, what we're starting to find is, I loved the 5 billion, and I'd say 8 billion ways to do things. And Graeber and Winslow have just come out with a book recently saying, you know, we think that there's a specific model, and there are lots of models out there of how to do things. So everybody's got their unique way of doing it, but it seems like they're asking similar kinds of questions of how do we engage people to do something collectively on purpose in these structures and processes. So there's similar kinds of questions that they're asking, and they found very different answers. So can we go sit with them and learn what they did and say, oh, I could do that. So how do you start to learn from others? And we've also started applying a lot of this in field work across 49 countries. We've worked in the last 20 years. And what that allows us to do is start describing what it looks like as we meet some of these folks What is it they're doing, and how can you start to shift their agreements? How can you start to be more explicit? So to summarize that finding, the basic idea we found is a lot of the ways we do things, we call them agreements because we can also say it's just an agreement. It's not a fact of physics or law of physics that it has to be this way. This is the way we're doing it right now. So we could change that. It's just an agreement. So, but a lot of the agreements that control how we do things within our organizations, whether you're one of these very high performing or not, a lot of that stuff is unconscious, is what we're finding. And that's straight out of sociology. 90-something, to not say all, of the structures or agreements around the way we do things are unconscious. And said, so would it be valuable to make them a bit more conscious? Which ones? So that we can see them more consciously, shift them, so that we can maybe hire the next, or bring in the next generation of leaders to do what we actually do well, not what we think we do well, as an example. So the big field study, and I'll share our example, what we found from this. Big field study we've been in for the last couple of years, microfinance institution, Latin America, in Mexico and Peru, 21,000 employees across 510 branch offices with 4 million clients. And here, this has been exciting because of how they've embraced doing this work and that we have access to all this data. So it took, as you can imagine, a good year plus going through a first round of survey data to show them that there's real value in this. So now we have access to all of their administrative data, their database, which is, I think, the hardest thing to get access to. But we're in the middle of that right now. And they've just committed by putting that into, in our lingo, into their corporate scorecard, means that this is strategic to who we are to understand our culture and how that relates to outputs, which I'll share in a second. And so we're going to start measuring this everywhere in our organization on a repeated basis, on a regular basis. So what are the findings? The higher levels of person-centered agreements. So they say, this bank says that it's about putting people at the center. That's their whole philosophy. And it sounds really nice. They have really good anecdotes, and they've been telling that story for 35 years. And the question that I had was, is that true everywhere? Because that's 100% the way you're talking about it. And what if it's not? And it turns out it was like a 75 to 80% of the groups or the offices operated out of this higher principle, but not all of them did. And for those of us that like to think of this way, I said, that's a natural experiment. I can find out in the same culture, the same structures, the same processes across 500 groups. Most of them do, not all of them do. And they figured out how to do that in your own culture. So what is it that's allowing them to do that, and does it lead to different impacts? We've used a bunch of, quite a few measures, the flourishing, another one from the Center for Work, Health, and Wellbeing, where I'm a department associate at Harvard, the Thriving from Work. I'm looking at their cultural practices. There are a lot of things that they do in their ritual work, and to see, are they consistent, and does that ritual work lead to something? So they're forming, so their business is, we're forming small groups of women, of 25 women who work together as a credit circle. And are there things that you do that improve that or make that stronger or not? And to summarize, what we've found is that the culture of leadership, the more the person and leadership within a business office or this service office holds that people at the center is really critical, and coming from that morality, then, and there we're looking at, the more they hold that culture, and there's a communal, spiritual, flourishing element to that, then it leads to greater flourishing amongst leadership. So where the leaders care about that and really believe that, and we find that out through the survey, then there's greater reported flourishing. It also leads to greater outputs and stronger outputs for their office. But their culture then also leads to the culture of the employees. So where the leadership holds that to be stronger, then the people in their organization also do that. But it's also where they hold it less, then there's less. And that's surprising because the recruiting isn't done on the office level. They hire people in that are really committed to these kinds of ideals, but it can collapse if our leadership doesn't hold that to be important. But that culture of the employees also correlates with the flourishing, the reported flourishing of the employees, and the outputs of what they're able to generate. So what we're starting to do is to try to connect the dots. All of these things are really important, flourishing and outputs, right? So we have to get the business results to be able to, our lifeblood. I mean, everybody here gets a paycheck of some kind, right? And we have to pay mortgages. So you're getting that. But is there a correlation between the way you hold people, when you think about people, and flourishing, and the results, what we heard about earlier and also. And so then we're finding that the leadership influences the culture of the employees, and the employees, it does impact their output also. And we're now looking at, and how does that affect your ecosystem? So then how I hold that also influences the ability to influence these groups that I work with, in this case, the hundreds of women in these credit circles. So the culture, there's a high correlation between how we see it and what we're able to generate in the culture of these groups of women, and their reported flourishing and their reported success and their outputs in their own business. So we're giving them a line of credit. They're using that money to invest in their businesses, and they're generating better results when there's a correlation with this culture. So a simple way of thinking about that is work that I'm doing with Katie through this initiative, Leadership for Flourishing. That maybe Leadership for Flourishing does have some correlation with the total value that you're generating in the system. Putting people at the center and caring about flourishing might lead to better results. And that seems obvious until you start to say, from that first perspective of, yeah, but that's nice, and we're going to get results, and it doesn't matter if you have the flourishing part. What we're showing is, putting numbers to it now, is when you don't hold that, you get far worse results. But we are starting to have enough data to be able to show that. So to start wrapping up, what we're wondering is that when you generate more value, total value throughout your ecosystem, that the regenerative health is also stronger and greater flourishing. And maybe it's just smarter and cooler to start thinking about flourishing, because it leads to better outcomes. It leads to more efficiency. It leads to greater productivity. You're more effective, you're more innovative, you're more efficient by not wasting all that energy. I mean, you have a more engaging experience, so it's smarter and cooler. So with my business students, it's not that you have to do this, it's just, why would you not? Are you willing to accept that you're a less smart and less cool organization because you're just going to extract a bunch of value from people and they're going to hate working with you? And so I have some, to finish, what we want to invite you to do is join us for what's coming. So in our Leadership for Flourishing work, which is part of the Flourishing Network that Matt leads, and with Katie, and the Leadership for Flourishing, we have a couple really cool things. And so it's inviting conversation for the rest of the day and tomorrow. The Global Flourishing Goals is an initiative that was started by one of our colleagues who's in the UN towards an agenda for 2050. And so what if we had the flourishing goals as the next agenda? We've already just developed a discussion paper. We're already starting to develop some pathways forward and getting some big support. And we'll share some of that tomorrow. Total value generated is what I've been talking about. And how do we start to connect flourishing and impact? And these are some of the organizations that we're doing this. The Big Bank, I just mentioned. Global Social Leaders, the organization Katie talked about, of young folks. The U.S. Military Academy at West Point, we're gathering data. The Vita Kidney Company, a kidney health company. So starting to gather some of this data. And I talked with a few of you, you got some great data sets. We can start looking at, does it make a difference, and how do you show that? We're coming out with our first World Agreements Health Report to start showing the social topography of the planet. Maybe this wisdom's all over the place and we're looking in the wrong places. Love as a unifying force in the universe is an initiative that Matt and I are developing to say maybe love is this really important thing, and maybe all of this is love, and how do you work with that and understand that and put the math to that. And then finally, the Global Flourishing Study with Byron and team, and I, the co-lead for the social support team. We're going to have amazing data from all across. So there's different ways to engage with us and say, it's very exciting, and that's why I think purpose, or flourishing, should be the purpose of an economy, because it's really stupid not to. And I say that because my students get that, my MBA students get that, my undergrad students, my exec ed, he said, why would I shut down all that energy? It's just not very clever. We don't know how to, but that doesn't mean we can't. And there are a lot of examples all over the place that we can. Thank you.